Hi there, and thank you for joining me for today's live reading of The Protector, the Freemasons Book 4 by Nicole Flockton, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. Sunlight filtered through a tiny crack in the window coverings. Renee kept her eyes shut, not ready to face what was a never-ending nightmare. She slowed her breathing and listened for the sounds of the low moans, the beeping of horns, the muffled sobs followed by the crack of a hand hitting flesh. Instead, she heard the sweet sound of birdsong. There were no cries or moans or horns. Opening her eyes, she looked around and breathed out. She wasn't stuck in the hellhole she'd been held prisoner in for the last couple of years. She was back in Australia. She was free. Or am I? Each morning, she went through the same thing, her heart racing in fear and desperation, dread filling her soul. Until Renee remembered she'd been rescued by her brother Jude and a specialized military-style team. Until she remembered that now she could roam around a house and not expect a hand to grab her and drag her into a room to be assaulted. Until she remembered she could now live her life the way she had before she'd been kidnapped. I can't, though. I can't forget, though, no matter how many times I speak to the therapist. She hadn't even scratched the surface with Philippa, the woman she'd been meeting with regularly over the last 3 months. Some things were too painful to recall. Shame kept her from voicing out loud the things she'd done, or, more accurately, been forced to do. She guaranteed that Philippa had an idea she wasn't being entirely truthful during her sessions, and she deeply appreciated the fact that Philippa didn't push her to elaborate. After throwing off the covers, Renee got up, went over to the balcony, and pulled the curtains open. The morning sun warmed her skin, and she opened the door, breathing deeply. After being stuck inside a building with few windows, all of which were boarded up tight for the last few years, she was never going to take the fresh air for granted again. As much as she tried not to, her gaze was immediately drawn to the small cottage situated a little bit away from the main house where she was staying. Declan Burkhard, her brother's best friend, and the man who had not left the property since she arrived 3 months ago, slept behind those closed doors. "Why are you still here? Don't you have a job to go to?" Whenever she'd ask him that, he'd always shrug and say he could work anywhere, and he wanted to be here with her. She was surprised Margot hadn't told him to leave. Where she was staying was a place for all people to work through their traumas and heal. During the 3 months she'd been here, Renee had met both men and women who had been in abusive relationships and were using this place to get themselves back on their feet. Many had gone and others had arrived. She was the only one who had been here for as long as she had. Perhaps the time had come to go home? Go back to trying to live her life. But what life did she have? Prior to being kidnapped, she'd been working at a job she didn't love, but at the time, she'd been happy. What do I do now? Who would take a chance and hire me after I've been missing for almost 3 years? The couple of times Jude and his fiancée Sienna, who had also been part of Renee's rescue team, came to see her, he always told her he'd help her find work. Heck, she could work in her family's company if she wanted to. But Jude worked there now, and he would hover in a way he believed was understanding and caring, only it wouldn't be. The pressure to not be able to be herself, her new self, in that environment, held her back. Like always, once she started thinking about her future, possible scenarios circled her mind, gathering speed until her head hurt. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, and if she wasn't careful, she was going to hyperventilate. Why is thinking about my future so scary? Gripping the dewy metal railing of her balcony, she closed her eyes and counted to 10, like Philippa had encouraged her to do when she got overwhelmed. She ended up counting to 30 before she was confident enough to open them back up and not collapse in a crying heap. She'd cried when she'd first been taken. Then she found that her captive saw that as a weakness and used it as a weapon. Eventually, every time she'd felt the need to cry, she'd control it and never gave them the satisfaction. Now that she was free, she still didn't let herself give in to her emotions, the survival instinct too far ingrained in her now. If I had a good cry, would it help? Would it cleanse my soul and help me heal? She didn't know, and she was too afraid to try. Too afraid because she was scared that once she started, she wouldn't be able to stop. Sighing, she looked out over the expanse of yard, her gaze once again darting in the direction of where Declan was staying. Her breath caught at the sight of him standing out front of his little cottage, staring directly at her. Even though he was a good 100 meters away, seeing him calmed her even more. Declan had no idea how much she looked forward to their lunches together, how much she valued his presence, even though she always asked him why he was still there and hadn't resumed his life back in the city. If she was being truthful with herself, she kept asking just to keep her distance from him. It would be all too easy to fall into Declan's arms and ask him to keep her safe. During her teenage years, she'd crushed on him. Hard. Her face flushed in embarrassment thinking about what she'd done when he had been at her house spending time with Jude. Groaning, she moved back into her room, but stopped. Declan was walking toward her. Her fingers gripped the railing a little tighter. His gait was smooth, and the early morning sun gave his bare chest a golden glow. A half-dressed male approaching her should scare the shit out of her, but this was Declan. Her mind somehow accepted he wouldn't hurt her, as though it could make the distinction between friend and enemy. She would hate to be frightened of every male that approached her, but perhaps she should be. After all, the friendliest person could actually be an enemy, an attacker. She brushed those thoughts away, but made a note to discuss those worries with the therapist. She didn't want to spend the rest of her life frightened. Why is Declan coming to see me? What's different about today? Normally, he didn't seek her out until lunch, where he was always polite to the point of being too polite. He stopped below her balcony and looked up, his smile light and easy. "Morning. How are you?" His voice washed over her like warm water, soothing her frazzled nerves. "Morning. I'm good. You're up early." He thrust a hand through his hair, giving it even more of a just got out of bed look. "Actually, I slept in. Usually by now I've been on a run." "Oh, were you up late last night?" How surreal was this moment? They were having this conversation as though they were in a tragic play where she was on the balcony and Declan was about to declare his undying love to her. Mentally, she scoffed at the image. Talk about ridiculous. But her life was a bit of a tragedy. Her innocence had been snatched away, and she would never be able to look at life the same way again. "I had some work to do with an overseas client. The time difference can be a real bitch at times." Renee nodded. "I'm sure." Declan looked away for a moment before meeting her eyes. "Do you want to have breakfast together?" Breakfast? Normally she ate a bowl of cereal in her room. Yes, she could go down the main common room and avail herself of the breakfast spread the cook laid out for everyone, but she liked the quiet and privacy of her own space. It was a routine she'd gotten into, and she didn't know if she could break it. "I can't break my routine. What if something bad happens?" The night she'd been taken had been out of routine for her. She didn't normally go to that library. If she'd gone to her usual one, she would have driven and not taken the train. What would her life be like if she hadn't been taken? As quickly as the thought came, she shut it down because, as Philippa said, there was no point in working through what-if scenarios. What happened had happened, and she had to accept it, which she did, but that didn't mean she had to like it. Sure. As if he could sense her hesitation, he took a step closer to the building, causing her to have to lean farther over the railing to see him. "What do you normally do for breakfast?" he asked, his voice mellow, like a whisper on the breeze. "I eat in my room." Declan nodded and stepped back. "I'll leave you to it then and see you at lunch like normal. Enjoy your breakfast." Her mouth dropped open as he walked away. He was going to give up that easily? Why was she fighting? Wasn't this what she wanted? But watching his retreating back, it hit her. She didn't want to eat alone. "Wait," she called out, her voice echoing in the early morning air. Declan stopped, but didn't turn around. "Please?" He turned at that and began to walk back toward her. "What do you want, Ren?" Once again, his voice was soft, as though not wanting to spook her. Nothing he did would spook her. At least she didn't think it would. She didn't know for sure because they never spent more than 1 or 2 hours together. "I'll ha—" Words lodged in her throat and she swallowed hard. She wanted this. She did, and as Philippa said, to move forward, she needed to take control of her feelings, not ignore them. Because while they were valid, she should control how she reacted to certain aspects of her life. Having breakfast with Declan was no different than having lunch, and she shouldn't make it seem like something bad would happen if she did something out of her normal routine. "I'll have breakfast with you." She was pleased that her voice sounded sure and confident. A slow smile stretched across Declan's face, a smile brighter than the morning sun peeking over the hills in the distance. "Great. Do you want to eat in your room, or would the common room be okay? It's possible that it could be a bit more crowded than it is at lunchtime." God, he was such a good guy. He'd given her the choices, handed control of the decision-making to her. He didn't decree that they would eat in her room. or the common room, or even his cottage. He left it up to her to decide where she would be the most comfortable. The common room is fine. I'll meet you there in 30 minutes. She could shower and get ready in that amount of time. 30 minutes is good. See you then. He lifted his hand before headed back to his cottage. Renee watched his retreating back, and when he got back to his cottage, he turned and lifted his hand again. She raised hers to return the gesture, and a flutter of something, excitement maybe, bubbled inside of her. It was a sensation that was both familiar and foreign at the same time, a sensation that she thought she'd lost. She took it as a positive sign that she was beginning to heal, to get a little more of the old Renee back, not that she'd ever come fully back. That naive girl was gone, taken in the cruelest of ways. Renee headed into the small bathroom connected to her room to get ready, hope springing to life inside her that maybe today was the start of her life moving forward. She had to get through breakfast and the change in her routine. Nothing bad was going to happen. Nothing at all. Chapter 2. Declan checked his phone to make sure the email had gone through to his assistant, relieved to see that it had. The reception at the retreat was spotty and made it difficult for him to conduct his business. He would have to go back soon, but he didn't want to leave Renee. Even though he wasn't with her 24/7 like he wanted to be, he was close enough that if she needed him, he would be there. Although in the time he'd been at the retreat, they'd met for lunch, nothing more. No casual catch-ups or dinner or even a chat. Always lunch. The day he arrived, he had been cautioned by Margot and Philippa, the therapist assigned to Renee, not to be too prevalent in her life, not to become a crutch to her. Anger had flared inside him. There was no way he would do anything to inhibit Renee's recovery, and he would make sure he didn't become the crutch they were worried about. Yet he listened to their cautious warnings and had limited his contact with his Renee. He was sure Margot, Philippa, and other staff were aware of how easily she'd sunk into a routine that kept her in her room most of the day. After what she'd been through, it wasn't surprising. Perhaps today could be different. Maybe he could be the one to nudge her a little to move forward so that she could eventually leave here and return to the city. He was sure that thought frightened her. Why wouldn't it, after the ordeal she'd endured the last few years? Renee hadn't shared what she'd been through, and he wasn't going to pressure her to tell him. The decision would be hers, and if she never did, he'd accept it. But now wasn't the time to think about her past. Time to focus on meeting her and hopefully enticing her to spend part of the day with him and go for a hike.